The smell of burnt rubber and gasoline still clings to my hair when I think about that night. The night my own flesh and blood looked me dead in the eye and said those words that would change everything. But I'm getting ahead of myself. What happened on that rain-soaked track 3 months later wasn't just about proving him wrong. It was about proving to myself that the fire I'd been smothering for 26 years was still burning underneath all the doubt he'd piled on top of it. My name is Sarah Martinez, and I've spent most of my adult life being the reliable one. You know the type. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The sister who remembers birthdays, shows up when you need help moving, and keeps her mouth shut when family dinners get ugly. I'm 32 now, work as a pediatric nurse at Children's Hospital, and drive a sensible Honda Civic that gets excellent gas mileage. Nothing about my life screams speed demon or adrenaline junkie, which is exactly how my younger brother Jake prefers it. Jake Martinez is 28 and everything I'm supposedly not. 6'2" with the kind of easy smile that gets him out of parking tickets and into VIP sections. He's been obsessed with cars since he could walk, turning our garage into his personal shrine to horsepower and chrome. Growing up, while I was studying for my nursing boards, he was rebuilding engines and talking about torque ratios like other people discuss the weather. Our parents, Maria and Carlos, always said Jake had motor oil in his veins instead of blood. They said it like it was the highest compliment they could give. Me? I was the smart one. The responsible one. The one who would have a steady career and sensible retirement plan. Nobody ever talked about what was in my veins, and I stopped asking a long time ago. Our family runs Martinez Auto Repair, a shop my grandfather opened in 1967 when he immigrated from El Salvador. It's located in a neighborhood that's seen better days, wedged between a laundromat and a taco stand that makes the best carnitas in the city. The building itself isn't much to look at: weathered brick, faded paint, and windows that rattle when the big rigs drive by. But inside, it's Jake's kingdom. He inherited not just the business when Dad's arthritis got too bad to work, but also the assumption that he was the only Martinez child who understood anything about what makes four wheels and an engine come alive. I spent my childhood in that garage, watching Dad and Jake work while Mom handled the books. I learned to change oil before I learned to braid my hair. I could identify the sound of a blown gasket from 3 blocks away. When Jake got his first car at 16, a beat-up Mustang that looked like it had been through a war, I was the one who helped him strip it down to nothing and build it back up. My hands were just as dirty as his by the time we were done, my knowledge of that engine just as complete. But somewhere along the way, the narrative got written that Jake was the car guy and I was the book-smart one. It became gospel in our house, repeated so often that even I started believing it. When relatives visited, they'd ask Jake about his latest project while asking me about my grades. When we went to car shows, Jake would talk shop with strangers while I stood quietly beside him, invisible. When Dad started teaching Jake the business side of the shop, I was already in nursing school, my path decided by everyone except me. The thing is, I never complained. Not really, I loved nursing. I was good at it. There's something deeply satisfying about healing people, about being the calm voice in someone's worst moment. When a kid comes into the ER scared and crying, and I can make them feel safe, that's real power. That's making a difference. So I told myself that cars were Jake's thing and healing was mine, and that was fine. Except late at night, when I'd drive home from 12-hour shifts, I'd sometimes take the long way. The route that winds through the canyon roads outside the city, where the asphalt curves like a river, and the guardrails are the only thing between you and a 100-foot drop. I'd roll down the windows, feel the engine respond to my foot on the gas, and for just those few minutes, I'd remember what it felt like to want something dangerous. Those midnight drives were my secret. Just like the racing videos I watched on YouTube when I couldn't sleep, memorizing the way drivers heel-toed through chicanes and hit apex after perfect apex. Just like the subscription to Road and Track magazine that I hid behind medical journals. Just like the way my heart would race when I heard certain engine sounds, the way some people react to their favorite song. Jake never knew about any of that. In his mind, I was Sarah the nurse who drove a boring car and worried about practical things like health insurance and retirement savings. I was the sister who brought homemade cookies to family gatherings and asked appropriate questions about his racing buddy's latest modifications. I was safe. Predictable. Known. Which brings me to that night, 6 months ago, the one that started everything. It was a Thursday in October, one of those evenings when the air still holds summer's heat but carries the promise of autumn. I'd just finished a particularly brutal shift. We'd had 3 car accident victims come through the ER, including a teenager who reminded me of Jake at that age, all bravado and bruises. It had been touch and go for a while, but we'd stabilized him, and his parents were finally able to breathe again. Days like that remind you how fragile everything is, how quickly life can change direction. I was exhausted in that bone-deep way that comes from holding people's lives in your hands for 12 hours straight. All I wanted was to go home, pour a glass of wine, and lose myself in something mindless on Netflix. But as I drove past the shop, I saw the lights still on and Jake's truck parked out front. Something made me pull over. I found him under the hood of a cherry-red Camaro SS, curse words in 2 languages flowing as freely as the sweat dripping from his forehead. The car belonged to Tommy Vasquez, one of Jake's racing buddies and a regular customer. Tommy was supposed to pick it up that afternoon for some weekend event, but clearly, something wasn't cooperating. Jake looked up when he heard my footsteps, his face streaked with grease and frustration. "Sarah, what are you doing here? You look like hell." "Thanks for the warm welcome," I said, setting my purse down on Dad's old workbench. "Rough day at the office?" He gestured at the engine with a wrench. "Rough day everywhere, apparently. This piece of garbage is supposed to be running sweet for Tommy's race this weekend, but she's missing on cylinder 3 and I can't figure out why. I've checked the plugs, the wires, the fuel injectors, everything." I walked over and stood beside him, looking down into the organized chaos of the engine bay. The smell hit me immediately: metal and oil, and something else, something slightly off. "Mind if I take a look?" Jake's expression shifted to something between amusement and condescension. "Sarah, I've been working on this for 4 hours. It's not exactly checking someone's temperature." The comment stung, but I kept my voice level. "I know, just humor me." He stepped back with an exaggerated bow. "Be my guest, Dr. Martinez." I leaned in and listened to the engine idle, letting the sound tell me its story. There was the miss on cylinder 3, just like Jake said, but there was something else, a slight irregularity in the rhythm, that suggested the problem might not be where he was looking. I traced the vacuum lines with my eyes, looking for cracks or loose connections. Then I saw it. The vacuum line to the map sensor was cracked, just a hairline fracture that would be easy to miss unless you knew exactly where to look. It wasn't causing the main problem, but it was contributing to the rough idle. I pointed it out to Jake. "This line is cracked. It's not your main issue, but it's not helping." He squinted where I was pointing, and then his eyebrows went up. "Huh. Yeah, okay, that needs to be replaced. But that's not what's causing the miss." "I know, but if you replace this and then check the coil pack on cylinder 3 again, I think you'll find your culprit. Sometimes when one system is running inefficiently, it can mask problems in another." Jake stared at me for a long moment. "Sarah, how do you even know what a map sensor is?" I shrugged. "I pick things up." The truth was, I'd spent enough time in that garage growing up to learn more than anyone gave me credit for. And I'd spent enough sleepless nights watching racing videos and reading forums to stay current with automotive technology. But admitting that would have required explaining why I cared, and I wasn't ready for that conversation. Jake replaced the vacuum line and pulled the coil pack on cylinder 3. Sure enough, it was cracked internally, invisible from the outside, but causing the exact problem he'd been chasing for hours. 20 minutes later, the Camaro was purring like a satisfied cat. "Damn, Sarah. That was good catch." Jake wiped his hands on a rag, looking at me with something I hadn't seen in years. Respect. "Where'd you learn that?" Like I said, I pick things up. I was already gathering my things, suddenly uncomfortable with the attention. I should get going. Long day tomorrow, but Jake wasn't ready to let it go. "Seriously, how did you know about the coil pack?" "That's pretty advanced troubleshooting." I paused at the door. "Jake, I grew up in this garage, same as you. Just because I became a nurse, doesn't mean I forgot everything Dad taught us." He was quiet for a moment. Processing. Then he said something that would replay in my head for months afterward. "Yeah, but knowing a little bit about cars and actually being able to work on them are 2 different things. I mean, it's not like you could actually drive something like this. You can barely handle a stick shift. The words hit me like a physical blow. Not because they were cruel, exactly, but because they were so casually dismissive. Like the idea of me behind the wheel of a performance car was so ridiculous, it wasn't worth considering. I've never had trouble with manual transmission, I said quietly. Jake laughed, not meanly, but with the easy confidence of someone who's never questioned his place in the world. Come on, Sarah. When's the last time you even drove stick? That old Honda of yours is automatic. I bet you'd stall out before you made it to the end of the block in Tommy's car. Something hot and tight formed in my chest. Prove it. The words came out before I could stop them. Jake's smile faltered. What? You think I can't drive stick? Prove it. Let me take it around the block. Jake's expression shifted to something between concern and embarrassment. Sarah, that's Tommy's car. It's got 450 horsepower and a racing clutch. It's not exactly a beginner's ride. I'm not a beginner. When's the last time you drove a manual transmission? I couldn't remember exactly, but I wasn't about to admit that. Does it matter? You either know how, or you don't. Jake ran his hand through his hair, clearly regretting the direction this conversation had taken. Look, I didn't mean anything by it. I just meant that you're more comfortable with, normal cars. Practical stuff. There's nothing wrong with that. But there was everything wrong with it. There was wrong with the assumption that I was too practical, too safe, too whatever to handle something with real power. There was wrong with the casual way he dismissed not just my abilities, but my right to even try. Forget it, I said, heading for the door. You're right. I should stick to what I know. I made it halfway to my car, before Jake called after me. Sarah, wait. I'm sorry, okay? I didn't mean to hurt your feelings. I turned around. You didn't hurt my feelings. You told me exactly what you think of me. And that's fine, we all have our lanes, right? That's not what I meant. Isn't it? He didn't have an answer for that. And I didn't wait for one. I drove home through those canyon roads again that night, but it was different this time. Instead of the peaceful escape they usually provided, every curve felt like a taunt. Every time I downshifted my automatic transmission, I thought about Jake's words. You can barely handle a stick shift. The casual certainty in his voice, like he was stating an obvious fact, rather than making an assumption. At home, I poured that glass of wine I'd been craving, and sat on my couch, staring at the blank TV screen.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. On the coffee table, half hidden under medical journals, was the latest issue of Road and Track. The cover story was about grassroots racing, local tracks where regular people could test themselves against the clock and each other. I'd read the article 3 times already, absorbing every detail about entry requirements and safety regulations. I thought about the teenager from the ER that day, the one who reminded me of Jake. He'd been racing his friends on a back road when he lost control and wrapped his car around a tree. As I'd worked to stabilize him, he kept mumbling about how he was supposed to be the fast one, how everyone would think he was a joke now. His need to prove himself had nearly killed him. Was that what I was feeling? The same dangerous urge to prove something that put kids in my emergency room every weekend. But even as I questioned it, I found myself opening my laptop and searching for local racing events. Not street racing, which was illegal and stupid, but organized events at proper tracks with safety equipment and medical staff. Places where you could find out what you were really made of without risking innocent lives. Willow Springs International Raceway was 3 hours away and hosted monthly time attack events open to anyone with a valid license and a car that could pass basic safety inspection. The next event was in 2 weeks. As I read the requirements and regulations, something started building inside me, a feeling I hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't anger exactly, though Jake's words had certainly lit a fire. It wasn't just about proving him wrong, though that was part of it. It was deeper than that. It was about the person I used to be before I let everyone else's expectations define my boundaries. The kid who had helped rebuild that Mustang, who had understood engines and power and speed not as abstract concepts but as living things. I thought about my patients, the ones who came back from the brink because they fought for every breath, every heartbeat. I thought about the parents who refused to give up on their children even when the odds were impossible.
I thought about what I told them, that sometimes you have to fight for what matters even when everyone thinks you should accept defeat. Maybe it was time to take my own advice. I closed the laptop and finished my wine, but sleep didn't come easily that night. Instead, I lay in bed thinking about racing lines and braking points, about the physics of cornering and the art of throttle control. I thought about what it would feel like to push a car to its limits, to find that perfect balance between speed and control where everything else falls away, except the pure connection between driver, machine, and road. Most of all, I thought about Jake's face when he realized he'd been wrong about me. Not just wrong about my driving ability, but wrong about who I was underneath the scrubs and the sensible life choices. Wrong about what I was capable of when I stopped playing it safe. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. I had 2 weeks to prepare, 2 weeks to remember everything I'd forgotten about driving fast and well, 2 weeks to transform myself from Sarah the practical nurse into someone who could make Jake eat his words. I called in a personal day and spent the morning at the library, checking out every book I could find on racing technique and vehicle dynamics. Then I drove to a large, empty parking lot on the outskirts of town and spent hours practicing heel-toe downshifts in my Civic, relearning the rhythm of manual transmission even though mine was automatic. I visualized the movements, the coordination required, the precise timing that separated smooth shifts from grinding disasters. It wasn't enough. I needed a proper manual transmission car to practice with, something I could use to knock the rust off my skills without risking someone else's property. More than that, I needed something with enough power to be relevant to actual racing conditions. That evening, I found myself back at the shop. Jake's truck was gone, but the lights were still on. I used my key to let myself in, breathing in the familiar smell of oil and metal. In the back corner, under a dusty tarp, sat a car I'd almost forgotten about, Dad's old project car. A 1989 Honda CRX-C that he'd bought as a rolling shell 20 years ago with plans to turn it into a weekend toy. Real life had gotten in the way, as it tends to do, and the car had been sitting unfinished ever since. But the engine was rebuilt, the transmission was tight, and underneath the dust and neglect was a car that had been built to be driven hard. I pulled off the tarp and ran my hand along the faded paint. The CRX was small and light, with a high-revving engine and precise steering that could teach you everything about the relationship between driver and machine. It wasn't fast by modern standards, but it was pure in a way that most cars had forgotten how to be. This was my answer. Not borrowing someone else's car or making excuses about not having the right equipment. This was taking responsibility for my own dreams, putting in the work to make them real. I spent the weekend going through every system on the CRX, replacing what was broken and upgrading what could be improved. New brake pads and fluid, fresh oil and filter, a thorough inspection of the suspension components. I worked slowly and carefully, partly because I was out of practice but mostly because I wanted to understand every component, every connection, every system that would keep me safe at speed. Jake found me there on Sunday afternoon, elbow deep in the engine bay, with a timing light in one hand and a wrench in the other. He stood in the doorway for a long moment before speaking. "Sarah, what are you doing with Dad's old CRX?" I didn't look up from the timing marks I was checking. "Getting it running properly." "Why?" "Because I want to drive it." Jake walked closer, taking in the organized chaos of tools and parts spread around me. "This is a lot of work just to drive around town. You know it doesn't have air conditioning, right, or power steering. I'm not planning to drive it around town." He was quiet for a moment, processing. "Then what are you planning to do with it?" I finally looked up at him, wrench still in my hand. "I'm going racing." The expression on Jake's face was worth every blister on my hands, every aching muscle from crawling around under the car. It was pure disbelief mixed with something that might have been concern. "Sarah, come on, you can't be serious." "Dead serious. You don't know anything about racing." "I know more than you think." Knowing about racing and actually doing it are completely different things. It's dangerous. People get hurt. I'm a trauma nurse, Jake. I know exactly how people get hurt. I also know the difference between calculated risks and stupid ones. He sat down on Dad's old stool, running his hands through his hair. "This is about what I said the other night, isn't it? Sarah, I was just giving you a hard time. I didn't mean anything by it. You were right though. I can't drive stick. At least I haven't in so long that I might as well not know how. But that's going to change. Jake was quiet for a long moment, watching me work. Finally, he said, "You really want to do this?" "Yes, why?" I set down the timing light and really looked at him, this brother who I'd spent my whole life supporting and accommodating. "Why do you race?" "That's different." "How?" "Because I've always been into cars. It's what I do, and maybe it's what I do too. Maybe I just haven't had the chance to find out." Something shifted in Jake's expression, a flicker of understanding, or maybe just uncertainty. "You really think you can handle it?" "I think I'm about to find out." He nodded slowly, then stood up and grabbed a wrench from my toolbox. "Well, if you're going to do this, you're going to do it right. This timing is still off by a degree." And just like that, we were working together again, the way we had when we were kids, and the world was simpler. Jake adjusted the timing, while I held the light, both of us focused on the rhythm of the engine, the subtle changes that meant the difference between good and great. As we worked, Jake started talking about racing. Not in the condescending way he'd explained things before, but as one enthusiast to another. He told me about track conditions and tire compounds, about the importance of smooth inputs and looking ahead. He described the feeling of finding the perfect line through a corner, that moment when everything clicks and you know you've extracted every tenth of a second possible. Most importantly, he told me about respect. Respect for the car, for the track, for the other drivers, and for your own limitations. Racing, he said, wasn't about being fearless. It was about being smart enough to know when to push and when to back off. We finished the timing adjustment as the sun was setting, the CRX idling with a smooth, purposeful rhythm that spoke of potential waiting to be unleashed. Jake stood back and listened to the engine, nodding with satisfaction. "She sounds good. Really good." I turned off the engine, and we stood in the comfortable silence of a job well done. Then Jake said something that surprised me. "I want to help you get ready for this. If you're really serious about racing, you need to know what you're getting into." I looked at him, trying to read his expression. "You mean it?" "I mean it, but Sarah, promise me something. If you get out there and realize it's not for you, you'll walk away. No shame in that. Racing isn't for everyone." I thought about that for a moment, and if I get out there and realize it is for me. Jake smiled, and for the first time in years, it didn't feel condescending. "Then I guess I'll have to stop underestimating my big sister." The next week passed in a blur of preparation and practice. Every evening after work, I'd meet Jake at the shop to work on the CRX and talk through racing fundamentals. We replaced the brake fluid with high-temperature racing fluid and installed new pads designed for track use. We checked every bolt and connection, making sure nothing would come loose, under the stress of racing conditions. More importantly, Jake taught me things I couldn't learn from books or videos. How to read tire wear patterns to understand what the car was doing. How to use reference points on the track to hit consistent braking zones. How to feel the car's balance shift through corners and respond accordingly. We found an empty industrial park where I could practice without traffic or police interference. Jake brought cones and set up a simple autocross course where I could work on car control at relatively low speeds. Hour after hour, I threaded the CRX between cones, learning to trust the car's responses and my own instincts. At first I was tentative, afraid to push too hard or ask too much of the aging suspension. But gradually, as my confidence grew and my muscle memory returned, I began to understand what the car was capable of. The CRX was eager and responsive, communicating through the steering wheel and seat of my pants in ways my Civic never had. It wanted to be driven hard, rewarded smooth inputs with precision, and forgave small mistakes with gentle slides that taught rather than punished. Jake watched from the sidelines, calling out corrections and encouragement. "More brake pressure there. Turn in earlier for that corner. You're being too gentle with the throttle. The car can handle more." Slowly I began to find the rhythm. Not just the rhythm of the course, but the deeper rhythm of performance driving. The meditation of focus, where the outside world falls away and there's nothing but you, the car, and the perfect execution of physics and technique. This was what I'd been missing all those years. This was what I'd glimpsed during those midnight canyon drives, but never fully experienced. This was the feeling Jake had tried to describe, but couldn't really put into words. 3 days before the time attack event, Jake announced that he was coming with me. "You don't need to babysit me," I said, trying to hide how relieved I was at the prospect of not facing this alone. "I'm not babysitting. I'm curious to see how my student performs under pressure." "Your student?" He grinned. "Hey, if you're good out there, I'm taking full credit as your instructor." The night before the event, I barely slept. I'd done everything I could to prepare. The CRX was mechanically sound. I'd studied videos of Willow Springs until I could visualize every corner, and I'd practiced until smooth downshifts and heel-toe braking felt natural again. But knowing you're ready and feeling ready are two different things. I lay in bed, thinking about all the ways this could go wrong. What if I embarrassed myself? What if I crashed? What if Jake was right, and I really wasn't cut out for this? But underneath the anxiety was something stronger: anticipation, excitement, the feeling that I was finally about to discover something important about myself, something that had been waiting patiently for me to have the courage to look for it. Tomorrow I would find out if I was the person I hoped I was, or just someone who'd convinced herself she could be more than she really was. Tomorrow I would learn whether the fire I'd felt burning inside me all these years was real, or just the reflection of someone else's flame. Tomorrow everything would change. The alarm went off at 5 a.m., but I'd already been awake for an hour, staring at the ceiling and mentally rehearsing every turn at Willow Springs. My hands were steady as I made coffee, my movements deliberate as I packed my gear bag. Racing suit, helmet, gloves, tools, water bottles, energy bars. Everything I'd need for what might be either the most humiliating or most liberating day of my life.
Jake was waiting in the shop parking lot when I arrived, leaning against his truck with 2 large cups of gas station coffee and the kind of nervous energy that comes from caring about something you can't control. He handed me one of the cups without speaking, and we both stood there watching the sunrise paint the mountains orange. "You ready for this?" he finally asked. "As ready as I'll ever be." The drive to Willow Springs took us through the Mojave Desert, past Joshua trees, and endless stretches of scrubland that looked like the surface of an alien planet. Jake had loaded the CRX onto his trailer, claiming it would be safer than driving it the 3 hours to the track and risking mechanical issues before we even arrived. I suspected he also wanted to keep me calm during the drive, giving me time to process what lay ahead without the distraction of piloting a race car through mountain passes. We talked about strategy, about the importance of learning the track gradually rather than trying to be a hero on my first session. Jake had raced at Willow Springs before, and he walked me through each corner, describing the elevation changes and tricky sections that caught inexperienced drivers off guard. Turn 8 was a fast sweeper that tightened up at the exit, punishing drivers who carried too much speed. The front straight was deceptively long, tempting you to brake later than the car could handle. "Remember," he said as we crested a hill and saw the track spread out below us, "it's not about being the fastest person out there today. It's about being consistent, learning something every lap, and coming home in one piece. Speed will come with experience." I nodded, but part of me was already calculating. I'd studied the track records for different classes of cars. I knew what times the other CRX drivers were running. I had goals that went beyond just completing laps safely, even if I wasn't ready to admit them out loud yet. The paddock at Willow Springs was a mixture of serious racing operations and weekend warriors living out their dreams. $1 million GT3 cars sat next to modified street cars held together with zip ties and determination. The smell of racing fuel mixed with barbecue smoke as teams prepared for the day ahead. Somewhere in this organized chaos, I was about to find out what I was really made of. We unloaded the CRX in our assigned spot, and I began the ritual of pre-race inspection. Tire pressure, fluid levels, wheel torque, brake pad thickness. Jake watched me work, occasionally offering suggestions but mostly letting me develop my own routine. This was my race, my car, my responsibility. The technical inspection went smoothly. The CRX passed all safety requirements, and the inspector complimented Jake on the quality of the preparation work. As we walked back to our paddock spot, I caught him smiling with pride. "What?" I asked. "Nothing. Just nice to see the old girl getting the attention she deserves." But I knew it was more than that. Jake was proud of the work we'd done together, proud of how seriously I was taking this whole endeavor. Maybe even a little proud of me, though he'd never say it directly. The drivers' meeting was held in a dusty pavilion,
30 or so people of all ages and backgrounds united by their desire to go fast in circles. The track officials went over the rules, flag procedures, and safety protocols. No contact between cars, no blocking, respect the passing zones. Anyone caught driving unsafely would be black flagged immediately. I looked around at the other drivers, trying to gauge the competition. Most were men, ranging from college age to retirement. A few had the confident posture of experienced racers, but many looked as nervous as I felt. There were 2 other women in the group, both driving modern sports cars that probably cost more than I made in a year. The track was divided into run groups based on experience level. Novices ran first, followed by intermediate and advanced drivers. I'd registered as a novice, which meant I'd have the track to myself with other first-timers and cars that weren't quite ready for the faster groups. It was the safest place to start, even if my ego wanted to jump straight into the deep end. Jake helped me get suited up, checking that my helmet was properly secured and my racing harness adjusted correctly. The CRX's interior had been stripped down to basics, with a proper racing seat and roll cage that made everything feel serious and purposeful. As I settled into the driver's seat and adjusted my mirrors, the transformation was complete. I wasn't Sarah the nurse anymore. I was a race car driver. The first session was 15 minutes of pure terror disguised as exhilaration. Following the pace car around for 2 slow laps to learn the racing line, then green flag, and suddenly I was responsible for navigating 11 corners at speeds that seemed impossibly fast after years of street driving. My hands were locked on the steering wheel, my shoulders tense, my breathing shallow. The CRX felt different on track than it had during our practice sessions. Every input was amplified, every mistake magnified. The first time I hit the brakes for turn 1, I nearly locked up the front wheels. The first time I tried to accelerate out of a corner, I spun the tires and had to lift off the throttle. But gradually, over those first few laps, something started to click. The track began to make sense. The reference points Jake had taught me became real places on real asphalt. My breathing deepened, my grip on the steering wheel relaxed, and I started to feel the car's balance rather than just fighting it. By the end of that first session, I wasn't fast, but I was smooth. I'd completed 12 laps without spinning or going off course. Most importantly, I'd felt that moment Jake had described, when the car stops being a machine you're controlling and becomes an extension of your own body. Jake was waiting when I pulled into the pits, his face a mixture of relief and excitement. How was it? I pulled off my helmet, my hair plastered to my head with sweat despite the cool morning air. Terrifying, amazing. I want to go back out right now. He laughed. That's the addiction talking. How did the car feel? Like it wanted to go faster than I was ready to let it. Good. That means you weren't overdriving it. What do you think needs work? Everything. I'm braking too early, turning in too late, and I'm probably losing 3 seconds a lap just from being scared. Jake nodded thoughtfully. Fear is smart when you're starting out. Speed comes from confidence, and confidence comes from seat time. Let's look at your times. My fastest lap had been 1:32.4, nearly 8 seconds slower than the track record for a similar car. But it was a baseline, a starting point from which to measure improvement. More importantly, it was proof that I belonged out there. The second session went better. My lap times dropped into the high 1:29. From more courage on the brakes, and more commitment through the corners. I started to understand the rhythm of the track, the way fast sections flowed into tight corners, and how momentum carried through elevation changes. But it was during the third session that everything changed. I was following another CRX, a yellow one driven by someone with considerably more experience than me. Lap after lap, I watched him take lines I hadn't considered, brake later than I thought possible, and maintain speeds through corners that I was still slowing down for. He was teaching me without knowing it, showing me what the track could give if you knew how to ask for it properly. On the 6th lap of that session, going into turn 5, he made a small mistake. Not enough to send him off course, just a slight bobble that scrubbed off a little speed. Suddenly I was close enough to pass. The smart thing would have been to stay behind him, continue learning, play it safe. But something else took over, some deeper instinct that had been waiting 26 years for this moment. I moved to the inside line and dropped down a gear. The CRX's engine sang as I downshifted, heel-toeing the way Jake had taught me, but with a smoothness that surprised us both. The yellow car stayed on the racing line, expecting me to back off. Instead, I held my position through the corner, trusting the car's grip and my own judgment. We went through turn 5 side by side, neither giving ground. Down the back straight, both cars at full throttle, wind noise and engine noise drowning out everything except the pure concentration of competition. Into turn 6, I had the inside line and held it, pulling slightly ahead as we navigated the complex. For the next 3 corners, I was in the lead. Me, Sarah Martinez, the practical nurse who supposedly couldn't handle a stick shift, running in front of a driver with years more experience. It only lasted until the front straight, where the yellow car's better aerodynamics allowed it to pass me back. But for those 3 corners, I had tasted something that would change me forever. When I came into the pits after that session, Jake was standing by the timing board with an expression I'd never seen before. Confused amazement, maybe, or proud disbelief. "What the hell was that?" he demanded as I climbed out of the car. "What was what? You dropped 4 seconds off your lap time." 4 seconds, Sarah. That's not gradual improvement, that's a breakthrough. I looked at the timing screen. 1:25. 1. Still not competitive with the experienced drivers, but fast enough to prove I wasn't just playing around out there. "I passed someone," I said, trying to sound casual. "I saw. That was good racing. Clean, respectful, but aggressive when you needed to be. Where did that come from?" I thought about it while Jake checked the car over for our 4th and final session. Where had it come from? The pass itself had felt natural, instinctive, like something I'd always known how to do, but had never been given the opportunity to try. Maybe that's what talent was, I thought. Not some mystical gift, but simply the courage to trust abilities you'd always possessed, but never tested. The final session was my best of the day. With the pressure off and nothing left to prove to myself, I focused on consistency and smoothness. My lap time settled into the low 1:26, and I found myself racing wheel to wheel with drivers who'd been doing this for years. More importantly, I was having fun. Pure, uncomplicated fun of the kind I hadn't experienced since childhood. Every corner was a puzzle to solve, every lap an opportunity to do something better than the time before. The fear was still there, but it had transformed from paralyzing anxiety into useful caution that kept me sharp without holding me back. As I pulled into the pits after taking the checkered flag, I felt different than I had that morning. Not just because I'd survived my first track day, but because I'd discovered something about myself that I'd suspected but never known for certain. I was good at this, not just competent, not just safe, but actually talented in a way that surprised even me. Jake was waiting with a cold bottle of water, and the biggest grin I'd ever seen on his face. "So," he said, "still think racing isn't for you?" I took a long drink of water, and looked back at the track, where the next run group was already taking their warm-up laps. "Actually, I think it might be exactly for me." The drive home was different from the trip out, where the morning had been filled with nervous energy and last-minute advice. The return journey was comfortable, contemplative. We rehashed the day's highlights, analyzed what had gone well and what needed improvement, planned modifications that might help the CRX go faster. But underneath the technical discussion was a deeper conversation about identity and capability, and the stories we tell ourselves about who we are. Jake kept glancing over at me as he drove, like he was seeing someone he'd never met before. "You know," he said, as we passed through a small desert town, "I owe you an apology." "For what?" "For assuming I knew what you were capable of. For thinking that because you chose nursing over cars, you couldn't be good at both." I thought about that. You weren't entirely wrong though. I did choose the safe path. I did let other people's expectations shape my decisions. Maybe, but today proved that's not all you are. As we crested the mountains and saw the lights of our city spread out below us, I felt a profound shift in how I saw my future. The track day had started as a way to prove Jake wrong, to show him that I wasn't the limited person he thought I was. But it had become something much more important. It had shown me that I wasn't the limited person I thought I was either. The next few weeks passed in a blur of research and preparation. I joined online forums dedicated to CRX racing, studied videos of professional drivers, and began planning modifications that would help me go faster. More importantly, I signed up for the next time attack event at Willow Springs, and the one after that, Jake became my willing accomplice in this new obsession. We spent evenings in the shop, upgrading the CRX's suspension and fine-tuning its setup. He introduced me to his racing friends, who welcomed me into their circle with the easy camaraderie of people who understood what it meant to need speed in your life. But the real change was in how people at work saw me. Word had gotten around somehow that Sarah from Pediatrics was racing cars on weekends. Colleagues who'd never shown much interest in my life outside the hospital started asking questions. How fast do you go? Isn't it dangerous? What's it like being the only woman out there? That last question bothered me more than it should have. I wasn't the only woman racing, just one of a very small number. And while the racing community had been welcoming, I couldn't ignore the fact that I stood out in ways that had nothing to do with my driving ability. It was Dr. Peterson, the head of emergency medicine, who finally put it in perspective. He found me reviewing patient charts during a quiet moment and sat down beside me. "Heard you're tearing up the racetracks these days," he said. "Just learning, really.
Still pretty slow compared to most people out there." He smiled. "You know, I used to race motorcycles when I was younger. Gave it up when I got married and had kids. Always regretted that decision." "Why did you give it up?" "Fear, mostly. Fear of getting hurt. Fear of what people would think. Fear that I wasn't really good enough to justify the risk. But listening to you talk about racing, I can hear something in your voice that I remember feeling. That sense of being exactly where you're supposed to be. Is that how it sounds? Like you found a piece of yourself that was missing." He was right, and I told him so. Racing had awakened something in me that I'd been keeping dormant without even realizing it. The part of me that wanted to push boundaries, test limits, see what I was capable of when I stopped playing it safe. The second track day went better than the first. My lap times dropped into the low 1:24s, and I found myself racing competitively with drivers who'd been doing this for years. More importantly, I'd stopped thinking of myself as a novice. I was still learning, still improving, but I belonged out there. It was after that second event that Jake made his suggestion. "You should enter the championship," he said, as we loaded the CRX back onto the trailer. "What championship?" "The West Coast Time Attack Series. They have a class for cars like ours, and you're already fast enough to be competitive. The season starts in March." I'd heard about the series but hadn't seriously considered entering. A championship meant commitment beyond weekend track days. It meant travel to different tracks, serious preparation, and competition against drivers who were there to win, rather than just have fun. "I don't know if I'm ready for that level of racing yet." Jake looked at me seriously. "Sarah, you're naturally faster than people who've been doing this for years. You have better car control, better racecraft, and better instincts than most drivers ever develop. The only thing you lack is confidence in yourself. You really think I could be competitive in a championship series? I think you could win it." That conversation planted a seed that grew over the following weeks. I researched the West Coast Time Attack Series, studied the competition, and calculated what it would cost to run a full season. It was more money than I'd ever spent on a hobby, but it was also an opportunity to find out just how far this newfound passion could take me. The series consisted of 8 races at 4 different tracks over 6 months. Points were awarded based on finishing position, with the championship going to the driver who accumulated the most points over the season. The cars were divided into classes based on modifications and power output, with the CRX falling into the street tuner category. Looking at the entry list, I recognized several names from online forums and magazine articles. These weren't casual weekend racers, but serious competitors with years of experience and heavily modified cars. The prospect of racing against them was both terrifying and thrilling. But what finally convinced me to enter wasn't the competition or the challenge. It was a conversation with my mother during our regular Sunday family dinner. I'd been telling my parents about the track days, watching their faces shift from concern to confusion to something that might have been pride. They'd never fully understood Jake's obsession with cars, but they'd accepted it as part of who he was. Now they were trying to process the idea that their practical daughter might have the same fire burning inside her. "Miles," my mother said as she passed around homemade tamales, "your father and I are proud of you for trying something new. But we're also worried."
Racing is dangerous. No, it can be, I admitted. But so is driving to work every day. The difference is that racing is safer because everyone's paying attention and following rules. My father, who'd been mostly quiet during the conversation, finally spoke up. When I was young, before I came to this country, I wanted to be a pilot. I loved airplanes, loved the idea of flying. But my parents said it was too dangerous, too impractical. They wanted me to learn a trade, something safe and reliable. I'd never heard this story before. Dad rarely talked about his life before immigrating to the United States. Did you ever regret not trying? I asked. Every day for 40 years. He looked at me with eyes that had seen more than I'd ever known. Don't spend your life wondering what you might have been capable of. Miłos, some chances don't come again. That night, I filled out the entry form for the West Coast Time Attack series. As I typed my name and address, selected my car class, and calculated the entry fees, I felt the same anticipation I'd experienced before my first track day. But this time, it was tempered by a deeper understanding of what I was committing to. This wasn't just about proving Jake wrong anymore, though that remained a satisfying motivation. This was about honoring the part of myself that had been patient for so long, waiting for permission to be more than practical and safe and predictable. 3 months later, I stood in the staging area at Streets of Willow, watching the sun rise over the California desert, and listening to the sound of 30 race cars warming up their engines. The CRX sat beside me, freshly prepared and carrying number 47, my lucky number from childhood soccer. Jake stood beside me, no longer the condescending little brother who doubted my abilities, but my crew chief and biggest supporter. Over the past months, we'd transformed both the car and our relationship. The CRX was faster, more reliable, more competitive. Our sibling dynamic had evolved from him teaching me to us collaborating as equals. "You nervous?" he asked, as I pulled on my racing gloves. "Terrified," I admitted. "But also excited." "Good. Fear keeps you sharp. Excitement keeps you pushing forward." The first race of the season was 15 laps around a track I'd never seen before. I'd studied onboard videos and walked the circuit during practice, but racing wheel to wheel with strangers for points was different from anything I'd experienced during track days. As I strapped into the CRX and adjusted my mirrors, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. 6 months ago, Jake's casual dismissal of my abilities had stung because part of me believed he was right. Now, I was about to start my engine and race for a championship that I actually believed I could win. The pace car pulled off the track, and 30 cars bunched up behind the green flag. In my mirrors, I could see drivers I'd researched and respected, people with years of experience and faster cars than mine. In front of me stretched 11 corners that would test everything I'd learned about racing and about myself. When that green flag dropped, I was ready. Not just ready to race, but ready to find out who Sarah Martinez really was when everything was on the line. The green flag waved, and 30 cars lunged forward like hungry predators released from their cages. I found myself in the middle of the pack, surrounded by machines that had been built for this exact moment. The CRX felt different under race conditions, lighter somehow, as if it understood the stakes had changed. Turn 1 at Streets of Willow is a deceptively fast right-hander that sorts the confident from the cautious in the first few seconds. I held my position through the chaos, watching experienced drivers make rookie mistakes under pressure, while I threaded through gaps that appeared and disappeared like mirages. By lap 3, I was running 8th overall and 2nd in class. The car ahead of me was a modified Miata driven by someone whose smooth lines suggested decades of experience. Behind me, a heavily modified Civic was looking for any opportunity to pass. This was racing at its purest, 3 drivers pushing identical speeds through identical corners, separated by nothing but skill and determination. The breakthrough came on lap 7. The Miata driver, who I'd been studying for half the race, made a small error exiting turn 6. Nothing dramatic, just a slightly late throttle application that cost him 2 car lengths. I moved to the inside for turn 7, and suddenly we were side by side down the back straight. He didn't give me racing room. Instead, he squeezed me toward the inside wall, testing whether I had the courage to hold my line or the wisdom to back down. For a split second, I considered lifting off the throttle, playing it safe, settling for second place in my first championship race. Instead, I held my line and trusted the CRX to do what we'd spent months preparing it to do. We stayed side by side through turn 8, neither driver yielding, both cars balanced on the knife edge between grip and disaster. Into turn 9, I had the better position and held it, pulling ahead as we crested the hill. The rest of the race was about managing the gap and staying focused while the adrenaline tried to convince me I was invincible. I crossed the finish line with a 3-second margin of victory, first in class and fifth overall against drivers with twice my experience and budgets. I couldn't imagine. Jake was waiting in victory lane, his face displaying an emotion I'd never seen before. Not surprise, exactly, but something deeper. Recognition, maybe. The acknowledgement that he was looking at someone he'd never really known despite a lifetime of proximity. "How does it feel to be a winner?" he asked as I climbed out of the car. "Like I've been one all along and just never had the chance to prove it." The season that followed was a masterclass in self-discovery disguised as a racing championship. Each track taught me something different about driving and about myself. Button Willow rewarded patience and racecraft over raw speed. Thunderhill demanded respect for its high-speed sections and punished overconfidence without mercy. Sonoma combined technical precision with tactical awareness, separating drivers who could think from those who could only react. More importantly, each race taught me about competition at the highest level. This wasn't the friendly environment of track days where everyone was just trying to improve their personal best. This was serious racing, where championships and reputations were decided by thousands of seconds, and tactical decisions made in the heat of battle. I won 3 of the first 4 races, establishing myself as the driver to beat in the street tuner class. The racing press began to take notice, writing articles about the nurse who'd come from nowhere to dominate a championship series. Sponsors started calling, offering support in exchange for contingency programs and logo placement. But it was the 5th race of the season that would define both the championship and my understanding of who I'd become. Willow Springs again, the track where everything had started. But this time, I wasn't the unknown rookie learning her way around. I was the points leader with a target on my back, and everyone expecting me to dominate. The pressure was different, heavier, more personal. Qualifying didn't go well. A mechanical issue during practice had cost us valuable setup time, and I could only manage 4th on the grid. In front of me were 3 drivers who'd spent the season studying my weaknesses and preparing for exactly this opportunity. The start was chaos. The pole sitter jumped early, but didn't get called for it. The second-place car had suspension failure in turn 2, collecting the third-place runner and leaving oil on the racing line. I managed to avoid the carnage, but found myself running 6th, behind cars I should have been racing for the lead. What followed was the hardest-fought race of my life. Lap after lap, I clawed my way forward, making passes that required every technique Jake had taught me, and some I'd developed through pure instinct. Each position gained felt like a small victory. Each lap completed without mistakes was a testament to months of preparation and years of suppressed ambition finally finding expression. With 5 laps remaining, I was running second behind Tommy Vasquez, the same driver whose Camaro I'd helped diagnose in Jake's shop 9 months earlier. He was driving the race of his life in a heavily modified Honda that was clearly faster than my CRX in a straight line. But I was learning that speed isn't always about horsepower. The pass happened in turn 8, the same corner where I'd made my first racing pass months earlier. Tommy got on the throttle too early exiting turn 7, breaking traction just enough to give me a run down the back straight. Instead of trying to outbrake him into turn 8, I took a different line, one that sacrificed speed for position, setting up a crossover move that put me ahead by turn 9. Tommy tried to repass on the outside through the sweeper complex, but I'd learned racecraft from watching videos of drivers who'd perfected the art of defensive positioning. I didn't block, which would have been illegal, but I used every inch of track to make his job as difficult as possible, while staying within the rules. I crossed the finish line with a margin of victory measured in inches rather than seconds. But more than just winning the race, I'd won something deeper. The respect of competitors who'd initially seen me as an interloper in their world. The confidence that comes from proving yourself under the most intense pressure. The knowledge that I belonged not just on the track, but at the front of the field. The championship was decided at the final race of the season, back where it all began at Streets of Willow. I arrived with a 12-point lead over my closest competitor, enough to clinch the title with a second-place finish, regardless of what anyone else did. But I didn't want to back into a championship. I wanted to win it the same way I'd approached every other challenge that season, by going as fast as the car and track would allow, and trusting my preparation to see me through. The race was perfect, not because everything went according to plan, but because when things went wrong, I had the experience and confidence to adapt. A late race caution bunched up the field for a restart with 3 laps remaining. Instead of playing in safe, I used the opportunity to make a statement, pulling away from the field in those final 3 laps to win by the largest margin of the season. Crossing the finish line as champion felt different than I'd expected. Not a moment of triumph, exactly, but one of completion. Like I'd finally answered a question that had been nagging at me for most of my adult life. Jake was waiting in victory lane with something I'd never seen before. Tears in his eyes, and not the happy kind. They were tears of recognition, of understanding, of apology for all the years he'd failed to see what had always been there. "I'm sorry," he said, as I climbed out of the car for the last time that season. "For what? For not believing in you sooner. For making you think you had to prove something that should have been obvious." I pulled off my helmet and looked around at the scene surrounding us. Photographers documenting the moment, competitors congratulating me with genuine respect, officials preparing the trophy ceremony. This world that had seemed so foreign 9 months earlier now felt like home. "You didn't make me do anything," I told Jake. "I chose to prove it. And honestly, I'm not sure I would have had the motivation without your doubt pushing me forward." He smiled at that, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him since this whole journey began. "So what's next? Defend your title next year?" I thought about that question during the long drive home, the championship trophy secured in the passenger seat beside me. What was next? More racing, certainly. The addiction Jake had warned me about was real, and I was fully committed to feeding it. But more than that, I was committed to exploring every boundary I'd previously accepted without question. The season had taught me that the person I'd been for 32 years was just one possibility among many. The practical nurse, the reliable sister, the woman who played it safe and colored within the lines. She was real and valuable, and I had no intention of abandoning her completely. But she wasn't the whole story. There was also the competitor who'd won 7 races and a championship. The driver who could make split-second decisions at 120 miles per hour. The woman who'd looked fear in the eye and chosen courage instead. 6 months later, I was back at Willow Springs, not as a competitor this time, but as an instructor for a racing school, teaching other people to find their limits and push past them, sharing the techniques that had transformed me from someone who supposedly couldn't drive stick to a champion. One of my students was a middle-aged accountant named Patricia, who reminded me of myself a year earlier. Competent, cautious, convinced she wasn't cut out for anything as dangerous and demanding as racing. After her first session on track, she climbed out of her car with the same expression I'd worn after my debut, terrified and exhilarated in equal measure. "How was it?" I asked as she pulled off her helmet. Like I've been waiting my whole life to feel that scared and alive at the same time. I understood exactly what she meant. That feeling of discovering capabilities you'd never tested, of pushing boundaries you'd never questioned, of becoming someone you'd always suspected you might be, but had never had the courage to find out. Jake still works at the family shop, but our relationship has evolved into something neither of us expected. We're business partners now, building and preparing race cars for other people who've caught the same fever that transformed my life. He handles the mechanical side while I focus on driver development and setup, combining our skills in ways that make both of us better. More importantly, he's learned to see me as I actually am rather than as he assumed I should be. The sister who can diagnose engine problems and execute perfect racing lines. The woman who chose nursing because she wanted to heal people, not because she was afraid of taking risks. The competitor who'd been waiting decades for someone to give her permission to stop playing it safe. The funny thing is, I never needed his permission. I just needed to stop waiting for it. These days, when people ask me about the championship, I tell them it wasn't really about proving Jake wrong. It was about proving to myself that the voice inside my head, the one that had been whispering about speed and competition and pushing limits, deserved to be heard. Everyone has that voice. Most people just never create the conditions necessary to listen to what it's trying to tell them. Racing gave me those conditions, but it could have been anything. Art, music, writing, business, adventure. The medium doesn't matter as much as the willingness to step outside the story everyone else has written about who you're supposed to be. I still work as a nurse 3 days a week, but now it's by choice rather than default. I'm still the reliable sister who shows up for family dinners and remembers birthdays. I'm still practical and sensible about most things, but I'm also the woman who can make a Honda CRX dance through corners like it was born for that purpose. The woman who looks at a racetrack and sees opportunity instead of danger. The woman who learned that the biggest risk isn't trying something that scares you. The biggest risk is spending your whole life wondering what you might have been capable of if you'd been brave enough to find out. The trophy sits on my kitchen counter, not because I need the reminder of what I accomplished, but because I like what it represents. Evidence that the stories we tell ourselves about our limitations are often just stories. Proof that it's never too late to discover who you really are when you stop letting other people's expectations define your boundaries. And sometimes when I'm driving home from a long shift at the hospital, I still take the canyon roads. But now they're not an escape from who I am, they're a celebration of who I've become. 2 years after winning my first championship, I stood in the garage of Martinez Racing Development, watching a 17-year-old girl named Emma climb out of the same CRX that had changed my life. Her hands were shaking as she pulled off her helmet, and I recognized the look in her eyes immediately. The same mixture of terror and pure joy that I'd felt during my first track session. Emma was different from my other students. She'd grown up around cars, unlike me. Her father owned a performance shop, and she'd been turning wrenches since she could hold them, but like me, everyone assumed her role would be supporting someone else's dreams rather than chasing her own. How was that? I asked as she steadied herself against the car. Like coming home, she whispered. Like I've been sleepwalking my whole life and someone finally woke me up. Emma's father, Rick, approached us with the familiar expression of protective concern mixed with grudging respect. His daughter had just completed her first advanced driving course, and the lap times she'd posted were faster than drivers with years more experience. She's got natural ability, I told him, real talent. Has she thought about competitive driving? Rick's face tightened. Racing is expensive, dangerous. Emma's smart enough to get a scholarship to any engineering school in the country. She doesn't need to risk that for some hobby. I'd heard variations of this conversation dozens of times over the past 2 years. Parents who supported their sons' racing ambitions without question, but suddenly discovered concerns about safety and practicality when their daughters showed the same passion and ability. It doesn't have to be either or, I said quietly. Some of the best engineers I know are also racers. Understanding how cars behave at their limits makes you better at designing them. Emma was listening to our conversation while pretending to organize her gear. I could see the conflict in her posture, caught between her father's expectations and her own desires. It was a position I understood intimately. Later, after Rick had left to handle some business calls, Emma approached me directly. What was it like? Proving everyone wrong. I thought carefully about how to answer. It wasn't really about proving anyone wrong. It was about proving something to myself. About discovering capabilities I didn't know I had. But weren't you angry? At your brother, at everyone who doubted you? Angry wasn't the right word. Motivated, maybe. Determined to find out who I really was underneath everyone else's assumptions. Emma nodded, absorbing this. My dad thinks I should focus on college, get my engineering degree, maybe work for one of the big automotive companies someday. He says racing is a distraction. What do you think? I think I want to do both. I want to understand how cars work from an engineering perspective, but I also want to push them to their limits. I want to feel what you felt when you won that championship. Her honesty was refreshing. Most people, especially young people, tried to hide their ambitions behind practical justifications. Emma owned her desires without apology. The racing world needs more engineers who actually understand what it feels like to extract maximum performance from a machine, I told her. If you're serious about both paths, I can help you navigate them. Over the following months, Emma became more than just a student. She became a reminder of why I'd started teaching in the first place. Not to relive my own glory days, but to help others discover possibilities they'd never considered. She enrolled in mechanical engineering classes while also joining our racing program. Her father wasn't thrilled, but he couldn't argue with her academic performance or her mature approach to balancing both pursuits. More importantly, he couldn't ignore the joy she radiated when discussing either engines or racing lines. Emma's development as a driver was remarkable to watch. She approached every session with scientific curiosity, analyzing deportment, constantly seeking to understand not just what worked but why it worked. Her engineering studies informed her driving, while her track experience gave practical context to theoretical concepts. By her sophomore year of college, she was competing in regional championships and consistently finishing on the podium. More significantly, she was designing and testing modifications that made our cars faster and more reliable. The combination of academic knowledge and real-world experience was producing innovations that neither approach could achieve alone. Watching Emma succeed reminded me of something important about my own journey. The championship I'd won wasn't the end goal, it was just the beginning. The real victory was discovering that I could be multiple things simultaneously. Nurse and racer, teacher and competitor, practical and passionate, Emma represented the next evolution of that idea. She was proving that you didn't have to choose between intellectual pursuits and physical challenges, between safety and adventure, between what other people expected and what you wanted for yourself. The breakthrough came during her junior year. Emma had designed a new suspension setup for the CRX based on principles she'd learned in her advanced dynamics class. The modification was subtle but significant, allowing the car to maintain better balance during aggressive cornering while improving straight-line stability. We tested it at Willow Springs during a private session. Emma drove first, familiarizing herself with the changes. Then I took a turn, curious to feel how her theoretical knowledge translated to actual performance. The difference was immediately apparent. The car felt more planted, more confident, more willing to be pushed to its limits. Emma had taken everything she'd learned about vehicle dynamics and applied it to create something measurably better. When I climbed out after my session, Emma was waiting with a tablet full of data analysis and barely contained excitement. "The lap times are down by almost a full second," she said. "More importantly, look at the consistency. The car is easier to drive fast, which means drivers can focus on racecraft instead of just controlling the machine." That modification caught the attention of several professional racing teams. Emma spent her senior year internship working with a factory racing program, applying her unique combination of academic knowledge and practical experience to help develop next-generation race cars. But perhaps more importantly, her success was inspiring other young women to consider paths they'd previously thought were closed to them. The racing schools started attracting more female students, many of them citing Emma's example as proof that technical careers and competitive driving could complement rather than compete with each other. The ripple effects extended beyond racing. Emma's story was featured in engineering publications and women's leadership magazines. She spoke at high schools about pursuing passions that didn't fit traditional expectations. Her message was simple but powerful: you don't have to choose between being smart and being adventurous. 3 years after that first driving lesson, I stood in the pit lane at Laguna Seca, watching Emma compete in her first professional racing series. She was driving for a team that had recruited her as much for her engineering skills as her driving ability, recognizing that the future of racing belonged to people who could optimize both human and machine performance. Jake was beside me, now serving as Emma's crew chief and benefiting from her technical insights in ways that were making him a better mechanic and strategist. The dynamic between them was different from our early relationship. Emma had never been dismissed or underestimated, so she approached collaboration with confidence rather than having to prove herself first. "She's going to win this thing," Jake observed as Emma positioned her car for the start of the race. He was right. Emma took the lead on lap 3 and never relinquished it, driving with the same combination of aggression and intelligence that had characterized her entire development. But more than just winning the race, she was demonstrating a new model for what success could look like. After her victory, as she stood on the podium accepting her first professional racing trophy, Emma caught my eye in the crowd and smiled. It was a smile of gratitude, recognition, and promise. Gratitude for the path that had been shown to her. Recognition of how far she'd traveled, promise of where she intended to go next. Later during the celebration dinner, Emma's father approached me. He looked different than he had 3 years earlier. Less worried, more proud, completely convinced that his daughter had made the right choices. "Thank you," he said simply, "for seeing something in her that I was too scared to acknowledge." "She always had it," I replied. "She just needed permission to explore it." That night, driving home through the familiar canyon roads, I reflected on how much had changed since that confrontation with Jake in the garage years earlier. The woman who had been stung by her brother's casual dismissal of her abilities now owned a successful racing school and had helped launch the career of one of the most promising young drivers in the sport. But the deeper change was in understanding that transformation isn't a destination, it's a process. I hadn't stopped being the person I was before racing entered my life. Instead, I'd added new dimensions, discovered additional capabilities, expanded the definition of who Sarah Martinez could be. Emma represented the next chapter of that story. She was living proof that the barriers people encounter aren't usually external obstacles, but internal limitations. That the phrase "you can't" is often just fear disguised as wisdom. My phone buzzed with a text message from Jake. "Emma's interview is on SportsCenter tonight. They're calling her the future of motorsports engineering. Thought you'd want to know." I smiled, remembering when the idea of a Martinez being featured on national television for racing achievements would have seemed impossible. Now it was just Tuesday night news, another barrier crossed, another assumption challenged. The story that had started with Jake's dismissive comment about my driving abilities had become something much larger. It had become about the power of refusing to accept other people's limitations as your own truth. About the importance of creating opportunities for others to discover their own hidden capabilities. Most importantly, it had become proof that the most dangerous phrase in any language isn't "you can't do that." It's "you don't need to try." Emma was trying, other young women were trying, parents were reconsidering their assumptions about what their daughters should want from life. The conversation was changing, one race at a time, one student at a time, one person at a time, discovering they were capable of more than they'd ever imagined. As I parked in my driveway, I looked at the championship trophy still sitting on my kitchen counter. It wasn't just a symbol of what I'd accomplished anymore. It was a reminder of what becomes possible when you stop waiting for permission to become who you're meant to be. The real victory wasn't proving Jake wrong about my driving abilities. It was proving that any story can be rewritten if you have the courage to pick up the pen and start over. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.